Having come from the early 80s, I've been able to see some drastic transformations in music technology, especially for EDM music production. In this video I want to show you some aspects comparing then to now and how far we've come and how we should appreciate what we now have in 2023. This video is not really aimed at the technical, but in fact I want it to be open out to the more general viewer, so I'll explain some technologies and terminologies as rather layman. Here's some history from where I come from regarding music production. When I was about 7 years old, I took to synthesizers. My uncle really helped here because he was a musician and he also had synthesizers. Of course, I lived in an era of electronic music with the likes of Kraftwerk, Jean-Michel Jarre, OMD, Human League, just to name a few. My first keyboard was from the Yamaha range. I could only afford the PSS range, which had the little mini keys. Now, these keyboards did not allow you to create your own sounds. They weren't synthesizers, and they had a limited number of presets and amount of notes that you can play simultaneously, called polyphony. They had very basic sequences, if they had any at all, and you could record your own tracks, but even the more expensive keyboards were limited to the maximum of 16 tracks. MIDI, Musical Digital Interface, was the latest and greatest technology in the 80s. It was the way to connect via cables from one equipped instrument to another so that they could communicate with each other. In basic terms, it means that you could play by one set of keys multiple other instruments. In the 80s, computers were very expensive. Most of the lads around my area had Atari STs, Commodore 64s and Amigas, whereas I was a little bit behind on this and I only could afford a ZX Spectrum. None of these had CD-ROMs or discs. They all had either cassette tapes or floppy disks. The Amiga 1200 was my first look into connecting my keyboards to a computer in order to expand the ability to record more tracks and get some visual feedback on the composure of my music. I had to purchase a separate MIDI interface for the computer to allow the two to connect, and software, the sequencing software, called Music X and Bars and Pipes. Now, this setup would not allow me to record any audio whatsoever into the computer. While you could load samples in a computer back in them times, I didn't have that technology to do that. And certainly my software that I was using wouldn't allow me to do that. All the sounds that were produced still came from the hardware keyboard itself, and only the note data was recorded and played back from the computer. Moving onwards to the 90s through to 2001, I was still on the Amiga 1200. I had purchased better keyboards over that time and was very productive, despite the limitations that I had. In 2001, I got my first ever PC. I had purchased software called Cubase VST32 version 5.1, and this for me was where doors started to open in advancements in computer technology. I was in total awe and felt lucky to have Cubase. Things looked very complex to me. I'd never seen or used anything like it before, yet I was very excited to dig in. VSTIs, or Virtual Studio Instruments, were available to me, which gave a virtual rendition of a real hardware synthesizer, but on the screen of the computer. These were very expensive and could still not quite compare to the real hardware in regards of its sound quality. My home studio comprised of a Korg X5 synthesizer, a Yamaha MT300 synth module which was still a synthesizer but it had no keys. These would be triggered off by MIDI via a Korg X5 keyboard. I also had a Roland JV1080 module and an Axis Virus module, all set up in a rack. I had all of these working with the computer by the use of a patch bay. This MIDI patch bay would allow me to connect all of them via cables so that I could record all of these from one single keyboard. Each time I created a track, I had to transfer the data used from each synthesizer individually in order for the same sounds to load correctly for that particular piece of music. This was called MIDI bulk dump. This at times failed and was very time consuming. Even at this point, I still had no way of recording audio into my computer. Each and every synthesizer was plugged into a mixer and recorded onto a tape deck. Tape decks were slow. You could not skip to a particular part with a click of a button. You had to rewind, stop, forwards, and so on. All my productions came out raw via the synthesizer itself. There was no extra music production going on with the audio files. There was no EQing and mastering going on. It literally was the sound that came out the synthesizer that went straight onto the tape deck. Some time went by and it got to the point that I lost my passion for music and I sold everything, all of my hardware, other than one keyboard, my Korg X5. I kept this keyboard as this was the first ever synthesizer that I'd saved up and purchased. Moving on some 6+ years, I'd got lost in the music technology. But a friend of mine tried to introduce me to a piece of software called Reason. Now I must say I was very skeptical and I wasn't really preparing to accept that any software producing sounds could ever compete with hardware sounds coming from real hardware synthesizers. But I was intrigued. What caught my attention was the software was trying to replicate a real studio environment. It would basically have rack mounts that you could put into a rack, and you could go behind the racks and can even plug and patch in the cables to different synthesizers like in the real world. So this is really what caught my attention. However, it still wasn't a replacement for the real hardware I once had. The sounds didn't sound as good. Reason couldn't load in VST instruments, although Reason did have its own synthesizers built in. They just weren't up to par with what I had in my physical realms of hardware. Propellerheads, the makers of Reason, made another piece of software called Record. This did allow me to record audio, so this was when I was able to record my brother singing. However, I was still not totally back on track with the music until Propellerhead started to produce their own version of VST instruments called Reason Racks. Things took on another level when now the synthesizers were giving me that comparison between hardware synthesizers and virtual ones. Still, regardless of this, I still missed that hands-on approach to real hardware, the sliders and knobs, but it was a significant shift for me in the music production having access to all these sounds and processing abilities. Hardware was beginning to be developed, with the goal to not produce sound but to control the sounds within the software. This comprised of a set of keys that had no sounds but acted as an input device only. As time went on, these controllers advanced and we got to the point that I could purchase something like a Novation SL61 Mark II controller. This was the next shift in how we were connecting hardware to the virtual world of music production. The knobs and sliders were programmed to work with the virtual mixer and instruments on your screen. For me, this was a huge advancement as now I'd fully come around from a total hardware setup to a mixed hardware and software setup, back to all sounds now coming from the computer. No more MIDI cables everywhere, no more heavy electric bills from running all them racks, and no more fading pan pots and sliders from excessive use. The limitations of polyphony were no longer. The limitations of just 16 tracks were gone, and now all sounds can be generated, mixed and mastered within the computer. Moving even further on, Propellerhead stopped producing their software called Record and put the recording capabilities into Reason. They then started to get third-party developers to produce rack extensions for both instruments and effect processors. Later Propellerheads opened up to VSTs, so now Reason become a contender to other digital audio workstations. Having access to VSTs would open up another world of technology. This area has significantly advanced since the last time I used VSTs. Synthesizers like Spire, Omnisphere were at my grasp. Today I have VPS Avenger, such a powerful synthesizer. With all this at hand and now to be processing this via Isotopes plugins, I have an entire recording studio at my hands. Having also recently purchased a Nectar Panorama P6 keyboard controller, I have come to the conclusion that I should really sit back and appreciate what I have now and be as productive as possible. Take a look at what you have. Really grasp the reality that today's technology has opened up the world to allow the creativity of each individual to be fully realised, from a virtual environment to the real world. Today you saw my choice of music software, but you could be using Cubase, Logic, Studio One, Ableton Live and so on. It makes no difference, it's the creator behind the tools that makes the music. In the next video I'm going to show you in more depth just how simple things are, yet also how complex things are for the home studio producer. I hope you'll join me in the next video to look a little bit deeper and show you hands-on what can be done with the hardware and how it communicates with the software.